So I've been called out by some actual scholars on Twitter regarding who killed Goliath. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and one of my favorite contradictions in the Bible is the question of who killed Goliath, because according to 1 Samuel 17, and as everybody knows, David killed Goliath. But we have this fascinating passage in 2 Samuel 21:19 where the narrative talks about a man named Elhanan killing Goliath. And Goliath is identified as the one the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. This is the exact same Goliath. And then in 1 Chronicles 20, verse 5, the text is slightly different. It says that Elhanan killed Lachmi, the brother of Goliath. And so recently when I shared that thought on Twitter in response to somebody talking about how all the Bible is entirely true, somebody responded to me and pointed me in the direction of a Vetus Testamentum article. Vetus Testamentum is a scholarly journal for the study of the Hebrew Bible. And this article was written by somebody named Kaspars Ozolins, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that last name. I apologize. It is sometimes written with diacritics, and I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but I'm going to stick with Ozolins until I am corrected. But anyway, in this article, Ozolins argued that Lachmi is inaccurate, that there was no Philistine named Lachmi. But he argues that brother of is original, that the text of 2 Samuel 21:19 is corrupt, and the text of 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5 is correct, and that the text says that Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, unfortunately, there's very little in this lengthy paper that actually discusses why we ought to take achi as more original than et. In other words, the question is which reading is earlier, this direct object marker that Elhanan smote et, indicating the direct object of the verbal action, Goliath, or smote achi Goliath, which would be the brother of Goliath. And here is the portion of the paper that argues for the priority of achi. And there's really only one reason given. And the reason is just that because we would expect et, the direct object marker, that's more likely. Achi then becomes the more problematic reading, the harder to understand reading. And there's a principle in textual criticism called lectio difficilior. The harder reading is usually the earlier reading, because usually when people are changing things, they are changing them to make them easier to understand rather than harder to understand. And so it would go from the harder reading to the easier reading, and because we would really need an et there, the direct object marker, that was probably what achi was changed to. Now, this is not a very good argument. In fact, it's not really an argument at all. It's an assertion. He just says, well, this is more likely. The big problem with this, however, is that achi actually resolves the contradiction. Because if you're reading the text, this is saying somebody other than David killed Goliath. The scribe is going to be like, what? It's problematic. And so the principle of lectio difficilior could be applied in the exact opposite direction as well. You could say, well, no, the far more difficult reading is the reading that directly contradicts 1 Samuel 17. And so changing it to achi would ameliorate that. That would resolve the contradiction. That would make achi the easier reading. And so the principle of lectio difficilior actually can be applied both ways depending on the scope of your concern. Is it purely grammatical, or is it textual in the broader sense of having to do with the story and its relationship to other parts of the Hebrew Bible? So I don't think the argument actually provided in that Vetus Testamentum article is valid. He just asserts, well, this is more likely, without even engaging the fact that this would resolve the contradiction. So I don't think that's a good argument. But then yesterday, Peter Gurry got on Twitter and he also challenged me. And here's what he said, where he's kind of engaging with a video of my own. And he points to not an academic article, but like a blog post that Ozolins published. And I went to that blog post expecting to find the same claim, but I found two entirely different reasons to think that achi is more original than et. The first one having to do with the fact that when there seems to be an alteration that is the result of the visual similarity of letters or words, that's usually accidental. And then the second one having to do with the fact that the contradiction didn't seem to bother anybody who edited the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So why would we imagine it bothered the compiler of 1st Chronicles? And both of these considerations, although entirely distinct from the argument that was presented in the peer-reviewed academic article, these are also both incorrect. Because yes, it is a text critical principle that when there is a variant reading and the variation has something to do with the visual similarity of the words, that's usually accidental rather than intentional. However, if there is theological significance to the variation, that has to come into play. You can't just say, oh, visually similar, that means that it was accidental, case closed. If there is theological significance, that weighs into the decision, because that text critical principle is not a hard and fast rule. It's just a trend. It's what normally happens. And so you have to consider other confounding variables. And here, obviously, there is theological significance to a change that resolves a flat contradiction of another biblical text. So the first consideration is certainly not determinative, and I don't think that weighty at all. But the second one is even more problematic, because the idea is that, well, if the contradiction didn't bother anybody who was responsible for editing 2 Samuel 21:19, why should we imagine it bothered anybody who was compiling 1 Chronicles? And there are a few reasons. One is that the books of Samuel and Kings were edited centuries earlier than the books of Chronicles, in a period when they didn't show as much concern for textual consistency, unity, harmony. And the editors of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel and the books of Kings were not all that concerned for that. There are a bunch of contradictions that are found internally within Samuel and Kings. In fact, even in the story of David's killing of Goliath, we have contradictions where David has to be introduced to Saul 2 different times. And scholars are in pretty widespread agreement that this is because the story is preserving 2 variant versions of Saul's introduction to David. So the editing of Samuel and Kings is earlier, is not as concerned with consistency, and already preserves multiple internal contradictions. So that's not really a good argument. And additionally, the books of Chronicles were far more carefully compiled and edited, and the editors had a proclivity towards altering what they found in the books of Samuel and Kings. So it's a much more unified, much more consistent editorial process, and it is altering a lot more commonly what is found in Samuel and Kings. So when we look at the tendencies of the editors of Samuel, Kings, and of Chronicles, what's more likely? That the editor of Chronicles altered this to get rid of a contradiction. And there are more reasons to think that, because Ozelin's argument, whichever one you pick, the peer-reviewed published version or the 2 identical versions we find in a couple of blog posts, ignores the fact that et, the direct object marker, the reading that would contradict 1 Samuel 17, is necessary for the text to work grammatically, because the verb comes first. We have this verb nacha, which means to smite or to kill. And then you have the subject that follows after, and this is Elchanan, and then it describes who Elchanan is. And then you have the direct object. And in order for that direct object to be identified as the direct object, you need the et. I looked using accordance through all the occurrences in the entire Hebrew Bible of the verbal root nacha being used in a clause to refer to one person killing another person, where the object is mentioned either with an object suffix or explicitly mentioning the object. And there are only a couple of different ways it occurs. Either the direct object marker et is there, or if it is an object suffix, a pronominal suffix attached directly to the verb, you can have that, or you have the inseparable prefix bet attached to the object. I can find no occurrence anywhere in the Hebrew Bible of ex nacha, smote, killed, with the sense of killed, y, where y is not carrying either the direct object marker et or the inseparable prefix bet. So the author of 2 Samuel 21:19 would have had to have written et in order for the text to be fully understood, because otherwise the text actually sounds like Elchanan, the son of so-and-so, the Bethlehemite, the brother of Goliath. It sounds like it's still describing who Elchanan is. You have to distinguish the direct object who is being smote or smitten from the description of the subject of the verb. So et is still far more likely. Now, somebody's going to say, oh, well, that makes that the more difficult reading, lectio difficilior, therefore the more difficult reading, ahi, is preferred. But again, this would entirely ignore the fact that ahi resolves a theological problem, a textual contradiction. And so you cannot make a case that ahi is more likely here without ignoring the fact that it's resolving a contradiction. You can appeal to lectio difficilior all you want, but you can't say that lectio is difficilior than the contradiction. The contradiction is obviously far more difficult. And so if we're appealing to lectio difficilior, we have to consider all of the lectia that are difficilior. So Ozelin's argument, at least when it comes to the priority of ahi in this part of the passage, the rest of his argument I don't really have a concern with, but it's not really relevant to my argument anyway. But this part of the argument for the priority of ahi, I think is very superficial. It is arguing by assertion, and it is ignoring a bunch of considerations that entirely undermine the argument. And these folks who are Assyriologists and New Testament textual critics. By the way, Ozelin's, as well as the two people who called me out on Twitter, are all associated with Tyndale House, which is an evangelical research library in Cambridge, UK. I found that interesting that all of them were affiliated with the same institution. I'm not saying there's any kind of collusion or anything nefarious going on, but I just thought that was interesting. I think the appeal to this argument falls flat. I don't think Ozelin's argument holds water, and I will continue to point out that this is a contradiction, and I have seen no data that make the conclusion more likely that it is not. And the fit for this video has been the McFarlane Amazing Spider-Man and the Black Desert Resort.